After we had been dating for about 6 months, my girlfriend and I decided to go on a vacation together. We live in California, so there are many great places to choose from. Neither of us was making a ton of money at the time though, and things can get expensive quickly out here. That's why we were checking Airbnb for a good deal. Eventually we settled on a place outside of Reno, Nevada, and it looked like a fantastic deal. It was a small house, but still more than enough space for the two of us. The location was also pretty good, since it was a short drive from Lake Tahoe and some other nice spots. The hotels around there can get really expensive, so it seemed like a really good find. It was about a 5-hour drive for us, and we left at around 11 a.m. on a Friday morning. We finally got there in the late afternoon. The house itself looked okay, just like the pictures we'd seen online, but the neighborhood was a different story. It looked pretty rough. The houses nearby were either falling apart, or it looked like nobody had lived in them for years. As we drove in, we saw at least 3 houses with boarded up windows, and one with a rusted old truck in the driveway. It was starting to make sense why the place was so cheap. I parked my car in the driveway of our house, because there was no garage. When we got to our house, it was pretty nice, especially on the inside. Everything was very clean and looked brand new, like a modern condo or something. After we were settled in, we decided to go for a walk. It was a long drive, and we needed to move our legs. It was just before dusk, and there was still some light from the sun. The vibe of the street was eerie, and we didn't see many other people out. Looking at some of the older houses, I became convinced that most of them could not be occupied. We passed one house with boarded up windows, and saw some city notice pinned to the front door. Right as we were passing it, a guy stepped out from the side of the house and just stared at us. He was about 45 or 50 years old, wearing a dirty blue t-shirt and ripped jeans. We didn't stop, just picked up the pace and made sure that we didn't walk back that way. It looked like he was coming towards us for a while, but when I looked back again, he wasn't following. Later that night at around 12, we were back at the house finishing a movie in the living room. There was a window at the front of the house, which is where the living room was. We had the curtains closed though. We were about to go to bed. My girlfriend went to the bathroom. While I was waiting, I went over to the window and peeked through the curtains. I spotted a group of 4 guys standing on the sidewalk, right in front of our place. One of them was the man with the blue shirt that we saw before. They seemed to be talking quietly, but then one of them looked straight towards our window and pointed. I was scared, so I called the Airbnb host to see if there had been any problems in the neighborhood. The host actually answered the phone and said that he was new to owning the house, didn't really know any of the neighbors. However, he suggested calling the cops if we felt scared. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, so we just tried to sleep it off. The next morning, we had some activities planned, but as soon as we stepped out the front door, we found that my car was stolen. We were stuck in that sketchy neighborhood without a car, trying to figure out what to do next. We called the cops right away, and when they came out there, I showed them the house where I saw the man the day before. Obviously, I couldn't prove that it was him, but he looked suspicious. When we got to that old house, the officer told me that it was indeed abandoned and taken over by the city for unpaid taxes. It was in unlivable shape anyway, and there's no way somebody was staying there. It wouldn't be safe. So I don't know what the man was doing hanging around there. After the police left, we called the owner to let him know what happened. He apologized profusely, but we were both annoyed because we didn't know we had signed up to stay in such a sketchy neighborhood. The owner must have bought that house cheap, put some money into it to make it look nice for Airbnb. Guests would never have guessed from the pictures what they were getting into. He offered to refund us for the stay, and even paid for our bus ride back home, a gesture probably meant to avoid a negative review. Even still, I felt it was my duty to leave an honest review about my experience. It wouldn't have been fair to the other guests if I didn't. I never found out what happened to my car, but I've been told that stolen cars like that are rarely recovered. In most cases, they're chopped up within hours of the theft, so it's probably not worth hoping that I'll get it back. It was a whole year before I was able to save up enough to get a new car, because I wasn't making much back then. It was a huge setback for us, and it could have been avoided with a quick search on Google Maps. We didn't do that, and we paid the price. About 5 years ago, I bought my dream house. I was 40 years old then, and managed to save up enough to get an off-grid house in the forest on a big chunk of land, over 20 acres. The property consisted of 2 separate buildings. There was a main house and a smaller guest house. I lived in the main one and put the guest house up for rent on Airbnb to help with my costs. There was a long driveway, and my house was about a half-mile from the main road. The guest house was nearby, but separated by a small patch of trees. That way the guests would have some privacy, and I would have some privacy from them. The 2 houses were in the same clearing, though, and the rest of the property was dense forest, with trails running throughout. Renting the guest house was easy, because my property was really fantastic. It was easy to put together an impressive set of pictures. The place was booked most of the time for the first year. Typically, my guests were couples or groups of friends on vacation. The guest house was 2 bedrooms, but it could easily sleep 5, so my guests were rarely single people. This story, however, is about one of those rare occasions. Sam was a young guy who wanted the place for 3 nights in the middle of a week. Since I lived nearby, I didn't bother to do the whole automated check-in system that many hosts use. I met him there and showed him around. Sam was a very quiet guy, about 20 years old. He was withdrawn, and I could hardly get a word out of him. Considering that he was there on vacation, I would have expected more excitement. It was none of my business, though, so I left him alone and went back to my house. The first night went by without any problems. I kept busy with my usual chores around the property and didn't hear anything from my guest. But on the second day, something caught my attention. I was working in my garden at around noon, and I could see my guest house through the patch of trees. There were 3 guys there, Sam included. I hadn't seen them arrive, and Sam hadn't mentioned any visitors. It felt weird, but as long as they weren't causing any trouble, I didn't see any reason to interfere. My official policy was that 3 guests could stay at the low price, but additional ones were an extra charge, so 3 people was fine. I thought it was weird that he showed up alone anyway, so it made sense that he had friends joining him. That night, I was up late reading a book on my computer screen. It was around midnight when I finally decided to go to bed. I got ready for bed, and then turned off the lights. I laid there for a while, but couldn't sleep, so I got up and walked around my bedroom. When I went past my window, something caught my attention from outside. I saw 2 lights moving through the forest on my property. It was too late for anybody to be out there. That's what I thought anyway. I knew there was a trail around where I was seeing the lights, but it was really late. It could only have been one of my guests, because my place was too remote. Random strangers had never wandered in before. I thought it was weird that they were out there, but it was not a big problem. They were allowed to explore the property after all. Maybe they thought the forest would look interesting in the dark. I don't know. Sam checked out the next morning by himself. When I was seeing him off, I asked him what happened to his friends. He nervously mumbled something that I couldn't really understand. He just said that they left. It was like he was surprised that I even knew about them, or maybe he was hoping I hadn't noticed. When I went in to check the guest house, it was in perfect shape. There was not a single dish in the sink, and it looked like only one of the beds had been slept in. I wondered if Sam's friends even spent the night, and if not, then why? Enough strange things had happened by then that I decided to follow the path where I had seen the lights the night before. I knew my way around those woods really well, so I was pretty sure that I knew where to check. On my first pass, I didn't find anything, but tried again. This time I poked around in the bush next to the path. Soon, I found 2 large duffel bags hidden under some brush. When I opened one of them, I discovered a pile of bloody clothes and a gun. I didn't touch anything else and called the police right away. My property turned into an active crime scene within less than half an hour. The place was overrun by cops and investigators. I tried to give them their space and focus on their work, but it was hard to ignore. Of course, I gave them the info on Sam, and they tracked him down. I didn't find anything out about the crime for almost a month afterwards, but eventually the details hit the news. Only then did I find out what those guys were up to on my property. They had committed an armed robbery in a town over 5 hours away in a different state. Sam had rented the guest house on my property to hide evidence. I guess they saw the pictures and thought it would be remote enough that nobody would ever find it. That wasn't the case, though. Although my property is big, it's not that big, and the bags were hidden just off the trail. They weren't even hidden that well. Those guys would have been better off just walking into some random woods and dumping the bags there. If they did that, then at least there would be no record of them being in that spot. Those guys were not the brightest, and luckily for the rest of us, they're behind bars now. Last summer, me and my buddies Grant, Dave, and George decided to spend a weekend in the mountains of North Carolina. We found a cabin on Airbnb that was off-grid in the thick woods. It looked like a nice secluded spot, and it was just what we were looking for. There was no internet, and we weren't expecting much cell service. We were all looking forward to disconnecting. Grant drove us there in his dad's old truck, a vehicle that had seen better days, but it was reliable enough for our adventure. It was definitely better than my Prius for the occasion. The drive was about 5 hours from our town, and as we got close, the scenery was great. As we drove up the winding mountain road, there were breathtaking views. We got there at about 4 o'clock, with lots of sunlight left. After settling in, we decided to take a walk around the area before it got dark. Not far from the road, hidden in the trees, was an old rusted truck. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, forest slowly growing around it. None of us went too close to it, because it was off the trail, and we didn't feel like climbing through the bush. I thought I might go back and take a look another time, but that night, we moved on. Before dark, the 4 of us were back in the cabin. For the rest of the evening, we made a fire and sat around talking with some drinks. It was a pretty basic cabin with a simple layout. It was just a single room on the ground floor, with a bed in one corner, a kitchen in another, and then the living room made up the rest of the space. There was also a loft up top with 2 twin beds. Grant and I took those, while Dave got the other bed. George was stuck with the couch for the first night. Both Grant and I had trouble sleeping, so after going to bed, we stayed up whispering to each other for an hour or 2. The loft was open to the rest of the cabin, so we tried to keep it quiet for the others. By around 2 in the morning, we heard something from outside. It sounded like something or someone was walking around the cabin. Our minds went straight to a bear or some kind of wild animal, given our location. We tried to look out the window, but it was way too dark to see anything. We decided it was best not to investigate, so we laid down and tried to sleep. The sounds eventually faded away. The next day, we did some more hiking and exploring. The natural beauty of the area was undeniable, and we made the most of it. As evening approached, we lit a fire in the pit in front of the cabin. It was a colder night, and we were all huddling close to the fire for warmth. Eventually, we heard a rustling in the bushes again. We tensed up, half expecting to see a bear emerge. But then George jumped, swearing he saw a person walk by. I spun around scanning the area, but saw nothing. Given the darkness, I found it hard to believe that he saw anything, but we didn't want to risk it. Bears can be dangerous, and to be honest, it was getting pretty cold, so we went inside. When we went to bed, I had trouble sleeping again, but Grant managed to doze off right away. I was laying awake for over 2 hours when I heard George get up from the couch on the main level. He went out the front door, and I assumed he was going outside to pee. Minutes later, he burst back into the cabin and turned on the lights. George started screaming that we needed to go right away. I was already awake, but it wasn't long before the other 2 were up as well. As I thought, George had gone out to use the bathroom with his flashlight, but while he was out there, he said he saw a man lurking around the cabin. He was convinced the man was still out there. None of us wanted to venture into the dark to check, so we spent the night together in the living room, waiting for morning. At first light, we cautiously stepped outside. I walked around the cabin for a few minutes, but didn't notice anything strange. Our footprints were all over the place, so it would have been hard to tell if there was anyone else there. But then, Grant called me over and pointed at his truck. The driver's side door was covered in scratches that hadn't been there before. It looked like somebody had tried to etch something into the paint, but whatever the message was, it was too messy to read. It was clear, though, that somebody had been there, and their intentions didn't seem friendly. Up until then, I was probably 50-50 on whether we had a visitor at all. We called the police once we were on the main highway, but never heard anything back. Our description of the man was vague at best, but I still thought it was worth checking the area for him. Our host didn't have much to say when we called him. I got the idea that he didn't believe us, and probably thought it was an animal. Can't say I blame him, because that's what I would have thought myself. After some time on the road, I remembered that old truck that we saw on the first day. I wonder if the man we saw was living there. There's no way that old thing was drivable, but he could have been using it for shelter. It would have been pretty creepy if that's what was going on. Maybe he was even there when we walked by. I did a cross-country road trip when I was 23. It It was the summer after I graduated, so I wanted a chance to unwind after finishing. I went to school on the East Coast and had some friends out west, so I used this as an excuse to visit them. Parts of the trip were exciting, but it was more boring than anything else. Having company would have been nice, but I couldn't convince anyone else to come with me, so it was a solo trip. Being a millennial, I decided to do the whole thing with Airbnb instead of hotels and motels. One of my stops was this place, just outside a small town in Idaho. It was a detour, about 30 minutes off the highway, down a quiet dirt road. I had booked the place from my phone when I stopped for gas the day before, and I was planning on spending a single night there, and getting an early start in the morning. There was nothing particularly interesting in the area, so it was really just a quick stop for some rest. I arrived at the house late in the day. It was already dark when I parked my car on the road out front. It was a small 2-story house with an empty field across the street and a few other houses nearby. I rented the main floor, aware that there was a separate unit upstairs with its own entrance right next to mine. When I got out of my car, I walked up to the front door. The porch light was on, so I knew I was in the right place. I looked around. There were no cars other than mine, so I was pretty sure it was just me staying there. It would have been almost impossible to get there without a vehicle. When I got to the door, I looked around expecting a lockbox of some kind for the key. But then I realized that I hadn't been given a code. I was about to call the host when I found a dusty key waiting on the doormat. It seemed like a strange way to do things, but I picked it up anyway and let myself in. The place was decent enough for a night, a little worn but comfortable, and more than enough space. About an hour after I got in, I was ready to call it a night. I brushed my teeth and settled into one of the twin beds that were in the only bedroom. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the sound of footsteps from the floor above. I was surprised, because I hadn't heard anything before, and like I said, there were no other cars that I could see. I was hearing footsteps though, and it sounded like 2 people directly above me, and it sounded like they were coming down the stairs. At that time I wasn't worried, because I thought they were just other guests. I laid there waiting for a few minutes, feeling a little tense, but then I heard a sound just outside my bedroom window. It was like a light tapping, or maybe a creaking. Then suddenly, I heard a sharp metallic sound from the window, like a lock sliding into place. Maybe a latch of some kind. I still don't know what that was. It was creepy enough that I got up and got dressed. I tiptoed through the living room with one of my 2 bags in hand. I thought about making a break for my car, but when I looked out the front window, I froze. There was somebody standing right next to my car, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out what he looked like because it was dark and my car was a fair distance away. I could definitely see the outline of a man though, and I think he was smoking a cigarette. I couldn't go out the front door, so I went out the side instead, then hid behind a tree. I pulled out my phone and dialed the owner in a panic. I needed help badly, and thought the police would take too long to get there. The owner never mentioned where he lived, but I didn't have any other choice, so I dialed his number. Even though it was late, the owner picked up his phone. I whispered that somebody was breaking into the house. I told him the upstairs guests were trying to rob me. Then I glanced over to my car and saw the man standing next to it. He was holding his phone up to his ear and looking around. I then turned my attention back to my phone. The man on the other end said,
"I'm on my way. Where are you hiding? I'll save you."
Something about the way he said that gave me a chill. I didn't trust him for some reason. I thought he might even be one of the men breaking into my place. I didn't answer and hung up my phone. As soon as I did, I looked back to the man at my car, and he lowered his phone right at the same time. That confirmed it to me. My host was trying to rob me. Hiding behind that tree, I had nowhere to go. I couldn't go inside to my car, and I certainly couldn't walk to get help from anywhere, definitely not without being seen. I did dial 911 at that point, but the police estimated that it would take over half an hour to get there. I waited there in the dark for almost 45 minutes, and nobody came. Finally, I looked back at my car and saw that the man was gone. I didn't know if he left for good or if he was coming back. Either way, I sprinted for my vehicle, got in, and drove away, leaving one of my bags behind. I called the police again, but I didn't want to stay in that town any longer than I needed to, so I don't know what happened afterwards. However, Airbnb did reimburse me for the stay, as well as the bag that was lost. I checked Airbnb again about a week later to see if the house was still there, but it had been taken down. I guess that's a good sign, but it would have been better if the host was in jail.